Hey guys, welcome back to Model Farm Studio. First, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's subscribed to the channel. I really appreciate your comments and feedback because that's ultimately what lets me know these videos are helpful for you guys, and that's the goal of this channel, so thank you. I really do appreciate it. That being said, I'd like to talk about one of the most challenging aspects of building a farm diorama for me personally, and that's the farmhouse. When you think about it, in 1/64 scale, our options for houses are really quite limited. For example, we have the Erdl Farm Country playset series, which had 3 houses that were produced as part of that in the 1990s. However, they're starting to be a little bit more collectible, and when you can find them, they bring quite a price. Outside of those, we have the Train World, which has a few houses in different scales. For example, HO scale, which is too small, O gauge, which is too big, and S scale, which is true 1/64th, only has, once again, a handful of options. So there are some manufacturers like Branchline within S scale that make some really nice house kits, but they're either A, not really a true reflection of a farmhouse, B, harder to find, or C, when you can find them, once again, they're really expensive. So I thought I'd put together this video to document my build process of putting together a 1/64 scale brick farmhouse. This house is loosely based off my parents' home, which is based in central Pennsylvania. It was built in the 1800s, and when my grandparents bought the farm in the 1960s, they basically gutted the house and renovated it, so it doesn't really look like the house that you're about to see me build here in the video, but I went back to a lot of the old photos and pulled those for some inspiration. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to leave those in the comments section below. And with that, we'll jump into it. Hope you guys enjoy. To begin, I gathered all my building materials, which you can find links to in the description section below. For construction of the walls, I used basic Elmer's foam board that can be purchased at most chain stores. Foam board is a great building material, especially for beginners. It's cheap, lightweight, strong, doesn't warp, and most importantly, it's easy to cut. I bought these sheets of resin-coated cardstock with 1/64 scale bricks laser cut into them. These were great to use and really replicated the brickwork quite well, as you'll be seeing a little later on here in the video. I picked up 2 different styles of windows for the house. Many farmhouses here in the Northeast have these big 6/6 double hung windows, so these fit the bill quite nicely. In some parts of the house, I also incorporated some of these smaller windows. Each pack included laser cut sheets of clear styrene to simulate glass and cardboard to use as blinds. 3 different doors were used on the house: a basic door, one with a transom above it, and lastly, this metal one, which I thought would add some character to the front of the house, serving as the front door. My parents' house has 3 separate chimneys, so I did the same for my house and incorporated these 3 metal chimney tops. As you can see, these needed a little prep work before they were ready for paint. I also planned for 2 porches on the house, one in the front and one along the side. I picked up these HO scale porch posts that I thought worked well for S scale. As I've shown before in some of my other videos, depending on the item you're looking at, different scales can often be incorporated into 1/64th. In the case of these porch posts, I felt they worked well because they do come in different sizes in real life. Once I gathered my primary building materials, I sketched out the walls on some computer paper to get an idea of the measurements that I needed to transfer over to my foam board. I drew all these designs in 1/64 scale using my S scale rollers. If you don't have an S scale roller, I highly recommend that you pick one up, especially if you do building projects like these. Once I was happy with my design, I transferred my plans over to the sheets of foam board. I won't spend a whole lot of time going over the dimensions or showing everything being sketched out, since this was very time consuming. In total, I incorporated 35 windows into the design of this house, so you can imagine how long sketching this all took. However, I will share that for this step, I essentially redid the drawings. I had to determine where to cut the openings based on the measurements of the framework on the back of the doors and windows. In other words, my drawings on the paper were only accounting for the trim or framing on the front of them, so I had to make sure that my cutouts weren't so large that they would just fall through. Once my drawings were on the foam board, I was ready to start cutting. To do this, I used my X-Acto knife with number 11 precision blades. It's important to have new blades on hand when you're cutting foam board to help ensure that your cuts are as smooth as possible. As soon as I felt my blade get dull, I replaced it with a new one. On to cutting the foam. You might notice that I decided not to cut the walls out before cutting the openings for the windows and doors. I did this because it was easier to handle while everything was still connected. There's a little bit of a technique to cutting foam board. Foam board is basically a thin sheet of foam that's sandwiched between 2 pieces of cardstock. When I cut it, I make multiple passes over the same cut mark. The first pass, I get through the initial layer of cardstock and try and focus on making my line as straight as possible for following passes. The second pass is usually cutting through the foam and scoring the back of the remaining layer of cardstock, and then that third pass I try to cut through the board completely. The cuts for these openings did not need to be perfect, as they were just to help make the house look a little transparent, as if you could peer inside the window. After the openings and sides were all cut out, I wanted to make sure that my walls lined up correctly, especially before I cut out the brick and styrene pieces. The foam board was far cheaper than the rest of my materials, so if I found an error, it would have been better caught at this point as opposed to later. With everything cut out, I was ready to start gluing the walls together. To connect them, I used my hot glue gun. While some builders might frown on the idea of using glue guns, I personally feel like there are situations where they can be quite useful when used properly. The reason I used it here was primarily because the foam core in the center of the boards is porous, so it can absorb glue up rather quickly. If the walls aren't secured together well, that can obviously create some structural issues. Hot glue creates an almost instant bond, and that means it doesn't easily absorb into the pores. At the end of the day, you can certainly use whatever glue you feel most comfortable with. After I measured everything again, I transferred the measurements to the brick sheets. Like before, I'll skip through a majority of this process. At this point, I just wanted to ensure that the sections of brick walls were scaled correctly to account for the dimensions of the house now that it was assembled. If you can't tell by now, I'm a strong believer in the old proverb, measure twice, cut once. Instead of cutting out the windows and doors, I decided to cut out the walls first. I felt it was important to make sure that these walls fit correctly against the foam board before I cut out these openings. As you can see here, being able to follow the laser cut grooves between the bricks with my X-Acto knife was quite nice. I used a pair of scissors to cut out the angled portions at the top of the walls. The alternating brick pattern made it a little difficult to use my X-Acto knife for these areas. Really, I could have used scissors to cut out everything, but like I said before, following the laser cut lines gave me nice straight cuts. With the walls cut out and sized correctly, I cut out the openings for the windows and doors. As you can imagine, my X-Acto knife was very handy for this step. I used rubber cement to attach the brick sheets to the foam board. This glue dries fast and works well adhering paper to paper. Even better, it doesn't cause buckling or bubbling. I applied this on both the poster board and the brick sheets to help ensure a tight, secure bond. Other glues that would work well for this job are basic PVA glues or something like Clear Grip Gorilla Glue. While the bricks dried, I prepared the windows and doors. These plastic items were great to work with because they were easy to cut out of the sprues and sand the remaining tabs off. After I finished sanding all the pieces with a file, I hit them with some basic white spray paint. Each of the clear plastic windows also needed cut from the sheets. The laser cutting process left behind some residual dust and haze on these pieces, so I soaked them in some Windex and then carefully dried them off with paper towels. Once these panes were cleaned, I glued them to the back of the windows. I use basic white Elmer's glue because it doesn't fog the windows like some super glues can, plus it's easy to remove after it dries if there's any extra. As a helpful tip for tedious gluing jobs like these, I like to load my glue up on a pin and then apply it almost like I'm painting with a brush. For some further detail, I decided to make a window-mounted air conditioner. To begin, I cut out a piece of grooved styrene to resemble the accordion-style plastic that spans a window. Afterwards, I cut out the lower panes of a window with my X-Acto knife and then sanded the sides down with a file. I then secured this to the back of a window with some super glue. For the air conditioner housing, I used a piece of square styrene tubing. Inside of it, I placed an HO scale crate to resemble a condenser coil that I then painted black. Once it dried, I glued a piece of expanded metal on the front to resemble the grill, and then framed it with some angled styrene to hold it all in place. I painted the sides of the air conditioner light gray and the grill black. I then glued it to the piece of styrene that I attached to the window earlier and added 2 pieces of wire underneath it to resemble support brackets. Next up were the metal chimneys and the front door assembly. Like many casted items, there's often a little bit of cleanup required, so I used my cutting wheel on my Dremel tool to remove the rough portions on the bottom of the door frame and the leftover casting residue around the chimneys. I decided to add a doorknob while working on the door. To add this detail, I just cut the head off a pin, drilled a small pilot hole in the door with my pin vise, and then dabbed some glue inside the hole to secure it in place. Once the glue dried on the walls, it was time for the fun part, painting the bricks. To do this, I used basic acrylic paint that you can pick up at any major craft store. I debated on a few different colors that had reddish clay tones, including some shades of red spray paint and brown primer. Ultimately, in the end, I decided on this Cafe au lait acrylic paint shown here, made by Craftsmart. Painting the walls was pretty straightforward. As you can see, I generally tried to paint with the direction of the bricks. All of the walls did receive a second coat of paint after this first one, just to make sure there weren't any parts that looked too thin. Just as a side note, you might notice the little foam board ledge on the inside of the wall in this clip. I added small pieces of scrap foam board to the walls where the chimneys were going. These metal castings actually had some legitimate weight, so I added these pieces to support them, basically like little shelves. I applied 2 coats of paint to the trim pieces before I cut them out of the sheet, then I painted the chimneys. As you can see, I used alligator clips to hold the chimneys. I then attached these clips to my third hand, which is a helpful tool for holding parts while they dry. Once all of these pieces had dried, I sprayed dull coat on them to secure the paint in place. If you're unfamiliar with acrylic craft paint, it can be rather easy to remove, so sealing it was necessary for the mortaring technique that you'll be seeing next. Applying the mortar was probably my favorite part of this entire build. For this technique, I used basic acrylic craft paint once again. Specifically, this paint was a shade of off-white called 515 Vintage White made by Folk Art. So my technique for doing mortar joints was quite simple. I brushed the paint on in small sections at a time, then wiped it off with a wet paper towel almost immediately. I did have to apply some pressure to remove the paint, which is why sealing the bricks up with dull coat was really important. The leftover paint that didn't get wiped off down in the laser cut lines between the bricks is what resembled the mortar. In spots where paint or mortar was missing, I just reapplied this technique again. Once again, I repeated this same technique on the brick trim work and the chimneys. You can do this same mortaring process on sheets of concrete block, stone, or brick patterns. After separating the trim pieces from the sheet, I cut 4 bricks off each side of them so they were the same width as the window frames. Afterwards, I painted the brick color on their tops and sides to help them blend in better with the rest of the house. Now we'll switch over to a portion of the stone foundation. I left a small section at the base of the walls uncovered so that I could incorporate some stone wallpaper. I used this paper instead of a rock stamped styrene sheet because it was thinner, which meant that it wouldn't stick out past the brick sheets that I glued to the walls. I cut a few strips of the stone paper, then glued them to the walls with rubber cement. You'll notice that I gave myself some extra on the edges just to ensure that I had plenty of coverage. I'd rather have a little excess material to trim off than not enough. I built the back porch before finishing the stone foundation by cutting out a piece of foam board to the correct length and width. To secure it to the wall, I inserted 2 push pins on the inside of the house wall for added support, and then ran a small strand of hot glue along the edges. Next, I painted the top of the foam board piece black to prevent any white from peeking through between the boards. By no means did this paint job need to be perfect, especially considering 99% of it was going to be hidden underneath the porch boards. Speaking of boards, I found some scrap wood to use for the floor. I cut each of these pieces in half with my X-Acto knife since I thought they looked a little bit too big when I mocked them up. I didn't want these boards to be cut perfectly in order to help give the porch a more worn down, tired look. Before I glued the boards down, I installed the door and windows in the porch area. I had to attach the door because the molding around the outside of it required some of the floorboards to be cut slightly shorter. I put the windows in because it was obviously easier to install them at this point as opposed to after the roof was on. Once again, I used a little white glue to hold these items in place. Really, the openings that I cut in the brickwork could have held them just fine, so this was more of just a precaution on my part. Next, I built some framing around the porch. Like the door frame, the location of these posts meant that some of these boards needed to be cut shorter as well. On a related note, I decided not to include realistic framing on any section of the house. In the past, I used to include trusses and framework, but now I only do so for my buildings that have removable roofs. Obviously, constructing those details takes significant time, and for something like the porch roof, the trusses underneath it would rarely, if ever, be visible. Once the framing was done, I installed the boards on the porch using super glue to hold each of them in place. I applied gray paint to the boards once all of them were in place. Later on in the video, you'll see me come back and apply a little weathering powder in some high traffic areas, as well as add a few other small details. For the porch posts and the parts of the framework that were visible, I applied some of this flat white paint. Since this paint was thinner and quickly absorbed by the wood, I was able to apply it in a little lighter fashion near the bottom of the porch posts to suggest as if they were aged from moisture and neglect. After some checking, I glued a small strip of wood on the wall above the framing. I did this to hold the roof in place and give it my desired pitch. So that transitions us over to working on the rest of the house roof. I thought for a while about how to construct the eaves in typical farmhouse style, and I finally came up with the idea to use I-beam styrene. I used this 3/16 inch I-beam shown here, made by Plastruct, to serve as both the fascia and the soffit. I cut the adjoining ends of these pieces at an angle using my chopper and then glued them together. An advantage of the I-beam was that it was lightweight, so it didn't add much stress to the walls. Once again, I used a small amount of super glue to adhere these pieces to the brickwork. I used white putty made by Squadron Products to hide seams or imperfections on the eaves. I use this putty for a variety of my projects, but most frequently for filling hood seams on tractors. I applied this using a combination of the tip of my X-Acto knife and my fingers. After it dried, I used a fine grit sanding stick to blend it in smoothly. Since the putty dries tan, I eventually went back and repainted all of these I-beam pieces white. I decided to add a few foam board triangles on top of the walls to help support the roofing and prevent it from bowing in the center. I also added 2 styrene squares to the corners of the front of the house where the ends of the I-beam met together. These squares helped hide the fact that these pieces were going in opposite directions, but also added a little bit more detail. As a side note, you might have noticed that I went ahead and added the chimneys to those little shelves that I mentioned about earlier as well. At this point, I was ready to start on the roof. Instead of shingles, I opted for some styrene that resembled tin like the roof on my parents' house. I used a sheet of this 14543 board and batten styrene made by Evergreen Plastic. After I cut out each piece, I notched slots in them to fit around the chimneys. This did require some rather precise cutting and sanding to get all of these pieces to fit together correctly. Once all the roofing pieces were cut out and fitting together properly, I spray painted them flat black. Knowing that the roofing was about ready to attach, I cut out a piece of scrap styrene to close the end of the porch. I was strategic with when I added specific details to minimize the chances of damaging them as I handled the house. The installation of the roof was straightforward, so I'll skip ahead a bit. To tidy up the seams where the pieces of roof met together, I attached some angled styrene. Using angled styrene like this is a great solution to hide the seams on the corners and rooftops of buildings. Now it was finally time to glue the rest of the windows in place. I liked using the white glue here because it was quite forgiving and simple to work with. For instance, the drying time was convenient as it gave me plenty of time to wipe up excess around the edges of the windows. Any residue that was left behind dried clear or could easily be removed. I also picked up these small HO scale wall mount entry lights that are part of the Woodland Scenic's Just Plug lighting system. I'm still kicking around the idea of incorporating working lights on this diorama, and if I do, I really like the idea of using this complete system. If I decide not to, I thought these would still look great for some added detail by the front door. To install the front porch lights, I drilled 2 holes in the wall with my pin vise. I ran the wires through these holes, wrapped them around the cardboard pieces that they came with, and then attached them to the back wall with tape to keep them from rotating. Once the wires were secured, I glued the light fixtures to the front of the house using a little super glue. Once all the windows were in place, I glued the brick trim pieces above them. These were simple to install and really helped add some nice detail to the house. At a later point, I may go back and paint all the keystones tan, but I skipped doing so initially because I wasn't sure if they would stand out too much. Next up was putting on the front door assembly, which I installed the same way as the windows. With the door on, I started building the front porch. I wanted this to look like it was built a little fancier, sort of as a contrast to the back porch. To begin, I used a small piece of foam to serve as the base that could sit underneath the door frame. I drilled 2 holes in one end of the foam with my pin vise to attach the porch posts. I then cut off the top tabs on these posts so that I could secure some bracing on them, which you'll be seeing me build next. I built additional framework to attach the top of the porch to the wall of the house and brace the posts together. After this framing was completed, I glued some of the stone paper around the sides, and then I painted the top of the foam board with gray acrylic paint that resembled concrete. The laser cut sheet with the window trim pieces also came with some other brick patterns as well. I incorporated 3 portions of one pattern around the edges of the foam board. These pieces received the same paint and mortar technique that I covered earlier in the video. Some groove styrene served as the face of the porch and a support for the roof. I also came up with the idea of using a piece of expanded metal to resemble a doormat. I painted this rectangle black and then carefully positioned it in front of the door. I decided to add gutters and downspouts to the house. For the gutters, I used some of this 9581 1/16 inch U-channel styrene made by Plastruct. To replicate the elbows and downspouts, I used 8149 1/16 inch square brass tubing made by K&S Precision Metals. Each piece of styrene was cut to fit underneath their respective sections of roof, and tiny end caps were installed where necessary. After I shaped the first piece of downspouting, it served as a template for the others. As you can see, I used my needle nose pliers to make these bends. You do have to be gentle when shaping brass, so I bent mine very carefully to avoid kinking and breaking. Once the downspouts were all bent and painted white, I glued each of them to their respective wall. Sometimes you'll see older homes with vines growing up the walls, so I decided to do the same with mine using some of this laser cut Virginia creeper made by Walthers. After a few twists to make the vines look more three-dimensional, I attached them to the back wall in a sprawling pattern. Now on to the roofing details, starting with the plumbing vent pipe. To incorporate this, I cut a piece of brass tubing to length and painted it white to resemble PVC. I then drilled a hole in the roof with my pin vise and secured the tubing in place with a dab of glue. I came up with 2 ideas to mask the fact that the chimneys were solid and not hollow. I started by painting the centers of the chimneys black and then made flue caps out of styrene and small pieces of wire to fit on their tops. I tried a few different materials to resemble mesh around the sides of the caps like they have in real life, but I wasn't really happy with the results. Nonetheless, I thought these were 2 very effective solutions that help enhance the realism of these chimneys. I bought this set of S-scale lightning rods made by Model Tech Studio. These came pre-painted flat black, so they were ready to install right away. Once again, using my pin vise, I drilled 2 holes in the angled styrene on top of the roof and then glued them in place. I'm a big fan of weathering projects that I build, and the house was no exception. I used this set of weathering powders made by Monroe Models that came with 4 different colors: light rust, grimy black, medium earth, and dark rust. I started by loading up the grimy black on a dry brush. The first place I applied this was underneath the air conditioner to suggest there was some moisture dripping down the wall. I also applied this powder to the roof to resemble some weathering and aging. I started at the top, then worked my way towards the bottom with my brush, making light fading streaks to suggest runoff. Some powder inside the gutters was okay with me, as it looked like grime buildup from over the years. I will share that if you haven't used weathering powders before and you care about your workspace being clean, be sure to put something down like a piece of newspaper, as they do tend to get everywhere. In my case, I just cleaned my cutting mat off after I was all done with weathering. I applied more of the grimy black powder on the porch as well. I thought this area would have been used more often than the front door, so I added a little to suggest some high traffic areas. For instance, the door might have been scratched up from dogs wanting in over the years. Some of the floorboards in front of the door and where the chairs might go might look a little rougher from frequent foot traffic. And lastly, the porch posts, where, once again, they would be more prone to weathering and decay from the elements. The other powder I applied was the medium earth. Since I plan on having flower beds in a garden close by, this powder helped create the effect that dirt was blown against the foundation over the years. Even better, it also lessened the semi-gloss shine of the stone paper. I picked up some of these chopped and dried leaves made by JTT Scenery Products a while ago, and this seemed like the perfect project to use them on. These came in fine, medium, and coarse blends and really resembled leaves quite well. I sprinkled a mix of these leaves in corners and areas where the wind may have swept them. To hold these clumps in place, I applied some white glue with an old brush. I also put some leaves in the gutters for some added detail. To help make these leaves look wet or darker from moisture, I soaked them in a mixture of alcohol and black ink. After I applied some glue in the gutters, I carefully stuffed a few in using my tweezers. No house would be complete without a few plants, so I used these HO scale potted flowers made by Knock. As you can see, these were full of detail. In fact, a few of the pots even had designs in them. I put one pot on the side of the front porch and a second one on the back porch. I really like small details like these as I feel like they can help give some life to my buildings. To give a clue of where all the dirt and grime came from on the back porch, I put a pair of 3D printed barn boots near the door. These boots were made by Jensen Diecast and are a great touch for around buildings and in the bed of pickup trucks. Some final touches were an HO scale electrical box and a gas meter made by Walthers. These pieces were part of a larger set of items and came in green plastic sprues. I painted these items gray and then cut them out of their sprues. You might have noticed that I attached the electrical box on one of the walls already since I felt like it was safe to install earlier in the build. However, because the gas meter was probably the most fragile item on the entire house, I decided to put it on at the very end. So that wraps up the house. I hope you guys enjoyed seeing this process and found some of my tips and techniques helpful. I always try to provide as much details as possible, but if there's anything you're wondering about, again, please don't hesitate to ask. Admittedly, I wasn't really sure how this build would turn out when I started, but I must say I'm very happy with the final product. As I said in the intro, this house took me about 2 months worth of time to complete, so gather your building materials, take your time, measure twice, and most importantly, have fun. As always, thanks for watching.